The day Opal Keller buried her father, 3 men told her the ranch would be dead before the first frost, and the cold certainty in their eyes was almost enough to make her believe them. She stood at the edge of the grave with her black dress already dusty at the hem, the Wyoming wind pulling strands of amber hair across her cheek, and she listened to every word those men said. Harlan Pruitt, her father's banker; Clyde Moss, who owned the general store and half the gossip in Caldwell Creek; and old Reverend Sykes, who had the nerve to tell her, just hours after speaking the words of God over her father's coffin, that the Lord helped those who made wise decisions, and a woman alone on 30 acres of struggling cattle land was not a wise decision. She thanked them each one, walked back to the house, sat down at the kitchen table, and cried until there was nothing left in her. That was the autumn of 1881, and Opal was 24 years old. The ranch had a name stamped on the crossbeam over the main gate, burned into the wood by her grandfather's hand: Keller Land. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't grand. 30 acres of high Wyoming grassland that turned to hardpan in August and snowpack in November. A main house that needed a new roof on the east side. 2 barns. A chicken coop that the foxes had learned to outwit, and a herd of 62 head of cattle that had dwindled from the 120 her grandfather had kept in his best years. Her father, Emmett Keller, had been a good man and a decent rancher, but the last 3 years before his death had taken something vital from him. A bad winter that killed off nearly 30 head. A summer drought that made the creek run so low the cattle had to be walked half a mile farther to water. And then the sickness that got into his lungs in the spring of 1881 and simply never left. Opal had nursed him through all of it. She had driven the cattle herself, learned the branding, learned the feed calculations, watched the old ranch hand Gus Perkins do every task twice so that she could do them once. She had kept the books, written the letters to the cattle buyers, mended the fences in the south field when the pronghorn pushed through in their seasonal routes. She knew this land. She knew it the way she knew the sound of her own breathing. What she did not know, as she sat at that kitchen table in the weeks after her father's funeral, was how close to the edge of ruin the finances actually were. When she spread the ledger books across the table and began to go through them with the sharp, careful attention she had always brought to numbers, the truth assembled itself slowly, like a storm building on the horizon. Her father had borrowed against the land twice. Once to replace the cattle lost in the bad winter, and once to repair the main well when it collapsed in the summer drought. The loans were held by the First Territorial Bank in Cheyenne, represented locally by Harlan Pruitt, who had stood at her father's grave with that particular mixture of false sympathy and quiet anticipation that only creditors managed to produce. The first payment was due in 4 months. The amount was $240. She had $61 and some change in the household tin. Opal closed the ledger, pressed her palms flat on the table and breathed. Then she opened it again, because closing it changed nothing. She wrote letters to 3 cattle buyers, informing them she intended to sell 8 head in the spring and asking for quotes on current prices. She wrote to the bank and informed them she was aware of the payment schedule and intended to meet it. She wrote to no one else, because no one else needed to know her business. That winter she ran the ranch with a skeleton crew of 2. Gus Perkins, who was 63 and had worked for her grandfather and refused to consider leaving, and a young man named Eli Barrow who had drifted through Caldwell Creek looking for work and was willing to take a reduced wage until things improved. She learned that the foxes had gotten into the chicken coop through a gap behind the water barrel, and she fixed it herself with scrap timber. She learned that the east barn roof didn't just need patching, it needed replacing, and she calculated that she could do half of it herself if the weather held. The weather did not hold. The first big snow came 2 weeks early in mid-October, and it came hard. She lost 4 head in a single week, 2 to exposure and 2 to a creek crossing that went wrong when the ice was thicker than it looked on the far bank and thinner than it looked where the cattle crossed. She drove the remaining herd into the south pasture where the natural windbreak of the ridge offered more protection, and she and Gus and Eli worked in rotation, sleeping in shifts, keeping the cattle moved and the water troughs broken open through the ice. She did not write to the bank a second time that winter. By February, she had lost 11 head total. She had 49 head of cattle, $61 in the tin, and a payment of $240 due in 2 months. It was Gus who told her about Isaac Walker. He mentioned it sideways, the way old men mention things they know will be resisted, working it into the conversation while he was mending a bridle and she was going over the feed inventory, as if it were just a bit of passing information rather than the most significant thing he would say to her all winter. Walker outfit came through Laramie last fall, Gus said, not looking up from the leather. Isaac Walker, young fellow, maybe 28 or so. Been working cattle drives up from Texas for 5 or 6 years. Word is he's looking to settle somewhere permanent. That's nice for him, Opal said, and wrote down a number in the feed column. Word is also he's got experience with range management, building up depleted herds, turned around a sick operation over in Carbon County 2 years back, the Hendricks place. She had heard of the Hendricks place. Everyone in this part of Wyoming had heard of it. The Hendricks family had been on the verge of losing their land to the bank when something shifted the second year, and now they ran one of the better medium-sized cattle operations in the territory. She put her pencil down. Gus, I'm just saying what I heard. I don't need a man coming in here to run my ranch. Didn't say you did. He kept his eyes on the bridle. Though I notice we're 14 head short of where we started the winter and the payments due in April. She picked her pencil back up. I'm aware of the numbers. Yes, ma'am, he said. I expect you are. She thought about it for 2 weeks before she did anything. She thought about it while she broke ice on the water troughs in the mornings, and while she did the evening feed calculations, and while she lay awake listening to the Wyoming wind work at the corners of the house. She thought about what it would mean to ask for help, whether that was weakness or just sense, whether there was even a difference between those two things in her situation. In the end, it was not pride that made up her mind. It was the ledger. She wrote a letter to the last known address Gus had for Isaac Walker, a boarding house in Laramie, and she made the letter straightforward and businesslike. She was the owner of Keller land in Caldwell Creek. She had 49 head of cattle, 30 acres, and a specific financial problem that required someone with range management expertise. She could offer room and board and a percentage of any profit generated in the first year, and if the operation turned around, she would discuss a formal arrangement thereafter. She told him the truth about the state of things, including the bank debt, because she had found that people who could not handle the truth were not the people she wanted around her. She sent the letter and went back to work and told herself she had done what she could do and the rest was not up to her. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday afternoon in late February when the snow was still thick on the ground, and the sky had turned the particular flat white of a storm that had not yet made up its mind, she heard a horse come through the gate. She was in the east barn when she heard it, her hands deep in a grain sack, and she straightened and walked to the barn door and looked out across the yard. He was on a dark bay horse, tall, with the kind of easy seat in the saddle that came from years of long riding, and not from trying to look like anything in particular. He wore a dark coat that had seen real weather and a hat with a brim that curved down just slightly on the left side from having been shoved up that way habitually. He had a bedroll and 2 saddlebags and a rifle in the scabbard, and he stopped in the middle of the yard and looked around at the ranch with the quiet, assessing look of a man who has learned to read land the same way other men read words. She walked out to meet him. He saw her coming and swung down from the horse before she reached him, which she noted because it was the respectful thing to do. He was taller than she had pictured, with dark eyes and a face that was weathered around the edges in a way that came from years of outdoor work rather than hardship. He held his hat and extended his hand. "Miss Keller," he said. "Isaac Walker, I got your letter." She shook his hand. His grip was firm, but not the performative kind of firm that men used when they were trying to prove something. I'm glad you came. Did you have trouble on the road? Snow's deep past the ridge, but the bay's sure-footed. He glanced around the yard again, not obviously, just a sweep of those dark eyes taking everything in. How many head did you winter? 49, she said. Lost 11 since October. Something moved in his expression, not quite a wince, more like a rapid internal calculation. What's your spring grass situation in the south pasture? She blinked. Most people who heard the number 11 started with either condolences or judgment. He went straight to solutions. Better than the north. The ridge holds some warmth. I moved the herd there in October. Smart, he said. That probably saved you another 4 or 5. They stood in the yard in the flat white February light, and she showed him the ranch the way she would show anyone who had come to help, which was completely and without softening anything. She showed him the east barn roof. She showed him the ledger, sitting at the kitchen table while Gus quietly made coffee and Eli Barrow pretended to be very interested in the boot he was resoling by the stove. She showed him the grazing rotation she had been using, and the water sources and the fence lines. She told him about the bank debt, and the payment due in April and the $61 in the tin. He listened to all of it. He asked precise questions at precise moments, not to interrupt her but to clarify. He had a kind of focused attention that she recognized, the attention of someone who treats other people's words as worth the effort of actually hearing. When she finished, he sat quiet for a moment, his hands wrapped around the coffee cup, looking at the open ledger. Then he said, I can help you make that April payment, and I think there's a path through this. But I want to be straight with you about what it's going to take. I prefer straight, she said. The herd needs to be culled properly and the best breeders kept. You'll take a short-term loss on the sale but position yourself better going into summer. The east barn roof needs to be finished before the spring rains or you'll lose use of it entirely, which means extra strain on the west barn and potentially on the herd. Your grazing rotation needs to change. The south pasture's been carrying too much weight on the eastern section. He paused. And I want to look at whether the North Creek can be brought back as a water source, because walking the herd half a mile to water every day is costing you in weight and in time. Gus was looking into his coffee cup with the expression of a man who was trying not to look like he was listening. What percentage are you asking for? Opal said. 20% of any profit this year above what it takes to cover the bank debt and operating costs. If there's no profit, I take what's in the room and board arrangement and we reassess. She thought about this. It was fair. It was more than fair, actually, for someone with his reputation. Why, she said. Gus said you turned around the Hendricks place. You could be asking more. He met her eyes directly. Because you were honest in your letter. About all of it. A lot of people would have dressed the situation up and hoped I wouldn't notice the truth until after I arrived. You didn't do that. He shrugged slightly, a gesture that was not casual. That kind of honesty is worth something to me. She looked at him for a long moment, this man she had known for 2 hours, sitting at her father's kitchen table in the late winter light. All right, she said. When do you want to start? He set down his coffee cup. I started when I rode through the gate. In the weeks that followed, Opal learned that Isaac Walker was the kind of person who did what he said he would do, which she discovered was a far rarer quality than it had any right to be. He was at work before she was most mornings, which irritated her slightly because she prided herself on being the first one up, and he was still at it after she had gone in for the evening. He did not order her about her own ranch, but he was direct and clear when he had an opinion, and he was right often enough that she learned to listen when he spoke. They were different in their approaches in ways that produced friction at first. She was systematic and thorough, preferring to work through a plan in order from start to finish. He was instinctive, responsive, the kind of manager who could read what a situation needed in the moment and adjust without losing the thread of the larger plan. There were arguments, specific, focused arguments about grazing schedules and which head to cull and whether to prioritize the barn roof or the North Creek restoration. The argument about the cattle sale was the worst of them. She had selected 8 head to sell to a buyer in Laramie, calculated the price she needed, and written the letter. He came in while she was writing and looked at the list and said flatly that she had the wrong 8. "These are the oldest animals," she said. "2 of them are your best winter hardy breeders," he said. "You lose those and next winter's going to be harder, not easier. I lose the bank payment and next winter won't matter because we won't have a ranch. You can get the bank payment from 12 head instead of 8 if you sell the right ones. Fewer animals, better price." She put her pen down and looked at him. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed and his hat pushed back the way he did when he was working something through. "Show me," she said. He came to the table and bent over the paper and they went through it together. And by the time they were done, she understood what he meant. Not just accepted it because he said it, but actually understood the logic, which was important to her. She revised the list. He was right. The 12 animals they sold in early March brought in enough to cover the April payment with $40 to spare, and she kept her 2 best winter-hardy breeders. She thanked him for it that evening at the supper table, which was just the 2 of them because Gus and Eli ate in the bunkhouse. She was not especially comfortable offering thanks, because she had spent enough years being underestimated that gratitude sometimes felt like admission. But she had decided early in her life that being fair was more important than being comfortable, and it was fair to thank him. "You were right about the cattle," she said, and then put a spoonful of beans on her plate and waited to see what he did with it. "He didn't do much," he said. "You were right that the list needed 8 at first. I just had different 8 in mind. You were more right than I was. This time," he said, with a quiet smile that appeared and disappeared so quickly she almost doubted she had seen it. She felt something shift in the room, very slightly, the way the air shifts just before a weather change. She looked down at her beans and decided she was imagining things. Spring came to Wyoming the way it always did, reluctantly, and then all at once, the snow retreating up the ridge while the mud season made everything twice as difficult before the ground firmed up. Isaac and Gus and Eli and Opal worked the east barn roof in a race against the spring rains, and they won it by about 4 days, finishing the last section on a Thursday and watching the first real rain of the season begin on Sunday. Standing in the doorway of the east barn that Sunday, listening to the rain on the new roof, Opal felt something she recognized after a moment as hope. Not the cautious, battered kind she had been carrying all winter, but something younger and more open. The sound of the rain on solid wood overhead, the herd settled in the south pasture, the bank payment made and receded, the east barn functional and dry. Isaac was standing beside her in the doorway, one shoulder against the frame, watching the rain come down across the yard. He smelled like sawdust and the horses and the particular outdoor smell of a man who has spent his day in the actual world. And she noticed this, and found that she did not mind it, which was itself a piece of information. "Good roof," he said. "Yes," she said. They stood in companionable silence for a while, watching the rain, and she thought that she had lived 24 years without ever having stood beside someone in exactly this particular way, where the silence between them was a presence rather than an absence. The North Creek project began in April. Isaac had the idea that if they cleared the channel in 2 specific places where debris had built up over years of neglect, the water flow would restore itself sufficiently to serve as a secondary water source, reducing the distance the herd needed to walk and saving significant time in the daily management. He said it would take about 2 weeks of hard work. It took 4, partly because the debris situation was worse than anticipated and partly because of a complication that neither of them had expected, which was that the downstream blockage turned out to be a partially collapsed old structure, a stone and timber arrangement that was either the remains of an old root cellar or a dam someone had built long ago and then abandoned. They spent 3 days trying to figure out what it was before Isaac found a piece of hand-cut timber with a maker's mark that he recognized as the style used by early settlers in the region, which meant the structure predated the Keller family's time on the land. It was a dam built by whoever had originally settled the water rights, and it had partially collapsed, but the remaining structure was actually still affecting the water flow. "Can we use this?" Opal asked, standing in the creek bed with her boots wet to the ankle, looking at the stonework. "If we reinforce what's standing and clear what's fallen," he said, "it'd give you a small reservoir, enough to see the herd through a drought year without driving them to the main creek." She looked at him. He was in the creek up to mid-shin, sleeves rolled up, hair dark with the creek water where he had pushed it back from his forehead, and he was looking at the old stonework with the same focused assessment he gave everything, this quiet competence that she had come to recognize as one of the most reliable things about him. "That's not 2 weeks of work," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's more, but the value of it is more too." He looked at her then, those dark eyes steady. "Your call." She stood in the cold creek water and thought about it. Thought about the drought year and the herd, and what a reservoir could mean in a bad summer. Thought about her grandfather's land and what it could be. "We do it," she said. The reservoir project became the shape of their spring. Gus had an old shoulder injury that meant he could not do the heavy lifting, so it was mostly Opal and Isaac and Eli working the creek, hauling stone and timber, reinforcing the old structure, teaching themselves a kind of cooperative work rhythm that asked each person to be where they needed to be without too much direction. She learned things about him in the way you learn things about a person when you work beside them every day. He was patient with Eli, who was young and sometimes reckless, explaining things without condescension. He was genuinely kind to Gus in the way that young men who understand something about age and service can be kind, not performatively but in small practical ways, making sure the easier tasks went to him without making it obvious. He ate what was put in front of him and thanked the person who made it. He did not complain about the cold or the rain or the hard work. He also did not talk much about himself, and she found this curious rather than annoying because she was not especially talkative about herself either, but she was curious by nature, and she found herself wanting to know things about him in a way that surprised her. She asked him about the Hendricks place one evening when they were sitting on the porch after supper, the kind of mild spring evening that Wyoming produced occasionally as if apologizing for winter. "Gus said you turned it around," she said. "What happened there?" He was quiet for a moment, the way he was when he was actually thinking about an answer rather than reaching for the comfortable one. They were good people in a bad situation. Creek had diverted about 15 years back, changed the grazing patterns, and nobody had really adjusted the management to account for the new reality. They were still running the ranch the way it had been run before the creek changed, and that model just didn't work anymore. "So you changed the model," she said. "We changed the model," he said. "The Hendricks family knew their land. I knew the cattle management. Between the two, we figured it out." He paused. "Mrs. Hendricks fed me the best biscuits I have ever eaten in my life. That helped." She laughed genuinely, and the sound surprised her slightly because it had been a while since laughter had come that easily. He looked at her when she laughed, just briefly, and there was something in his expression that she thought about later when she was lying in her bed looking at the ceiling and listening to the Wyoming night. The reservoir was finished in late May, a stone-reinforced structure that created a small, clear pool deep enough to serve the herd through the driest weeks of summer. When they opened the channel and watched the water fill it for the first time, all four of them stood there, Opal and Isaac and Gus and Eli, and nobody said anything for a long moment. Then Gus said, "Your grandfather would have been glad to see that." Opal felt the words land somewhere deep and tender, and she pressed her lips together and nodded once. She did not look at Isaac because she knew if she did she might cry, and she was not ready to do that in front of anyone. But she felt him move just slightly, to stand an inch closer beside her, and she was grateful for it in a way she could not have articulated. Summer brought heat, and the kind of relentless blue sky that made you understand what drought meant even in a good year. The reservoir was not tested severely that summer because the rainfall was adequate, but having it there changed the daily management in small ways that added up, allowing Opal and her crew to spend time on other things rather than the extended water drives. The herd was doing well. Isaac had been right about the culling, and the animals they had kept through the winter and into spring were healthy and well-conditioned, and the two winter-hardy breeders had both dropped calves in April. She was building back toward what the ranch had been in her grandfather's day, slower than she would have liked but in the right direction. In July, something happened that Opal had not anticipated, and that tested everything she had been building. Harlan Prout came to the ranch. He came on a weekday morning when she was doing the books at the kitchen table, and Isaac was out checking the fence line on the north pasture. Prout arrived in his buggy, dressed as though he was making a business call in town rather than driving 3 miles of ranch road, and he came in with that particular expression he wore, the one that was not quite condescending, but was not quite not condescending either. He sat down at the kitchen table without being invited to sit down, which she noted, and he said he had been hearing that she was making improvements to the property, and he wanted to make sure she understood the terms of her father's loans, specifically a clause she might have overlooked. She had not overlooked any clause. She had read the loan documents 3 times, but she let him speak because she had learned that letting people explain themselves was useful. The clause in question, Prout said, was a provision that allowed the bank to call the outstanding balance due in full if the management of the ranch changed substantially. Since she had, as he put it, brought in outside management, there was a question about whether that provision applied. She looked at him for a long moment. Isaac Walker is not the management of this ranch, she said. He is a hired hand. I am the management of this ranch. I am also the owner. Both of those things were true when my father died, and they are still true now. The bank may see it differently. The bank should make sure it understands what it sees before it acts on what it thinks it sees, she said. The clause you are referring to applies to a change in ownership, not to the employment of additional labor. If the bank's legal counsel reads the document and arrives at a different interpretation, I am prepared to discuss it in writing through the territorial courts. Prout blinked at her. I have made both scheduled payments on time, she continued. I intend to make all future payments on time. If the bank has any actual concern about this loan, I invite them to put it in writing. Otherwise, I think we have concluded our business for today. He left 20 minutes later, and she sat at the kitchen table until the sound of the buggy wheels faded down the road, and then she put her head down on her arms and breathed. She heard the back door open and then Isaac's voice saying her name quietly, and she lifted her head. He was in the doorway, still in his working clothes, and he must have seen the buggy leaving because his expression was careful. Prout, she said simply. I saw the buggy. What did he want? She told him. He listened with his arms crossed and that particular stillness he had when something had made him angry, but he was not going to let it run away with him. When she finished, he said, Did he threaten the loan? He suggested it. I told him to put anything he had to say in writing and that I would respond through the courts. Good, he said, and then quieter, you all right? She almost said yes automatically, which was what she always said because it was what you said. But she looked at him and said instead, I will be. It was rattling. He moved into the kitchen and sat down across from her at the table, and he said, I can go to Laramie, talk to a land attorney. Make sure the loan documents say exactly what you think they say. I know what they say. I know you do. But having a lawyer's name on a letter to the bank is different from you being right. He met her eyes. Let me help with this part. She considered this. The part of her that had been managing everything alone for almost a year wanted to say she had it handled. The honest part of her recognized that he was right about the value of a lawyer's letter, and that she had been carrying the weight of this ranch and this bank, and this fear for long enough that having someone offer to carry a piece of it was not weakness but relief. All right, she said. Thank you. He nodded once and went to pour himself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove. And when he set a second cup in front of her without asking, she realized she had been looking at him for a moment longer than she had intended, and she looked down at the cup and wrapped both hands around it and said nothing. The attorney in Laramie reviewed the loan documents and provided a written opinion confirming that the bank's interpretation of the management clause was not supported by the plain language of the contract. The letter went to Harlan Pruitt at the First Territorial Bank. Opal did not hear from Pruitt again that summer, but the encounter had done something to her, not damaged her but clarified something. Made her understand in a concrete way how fragile the thing she was building still was, how many people were waiting with a certain readiness for her to fail. And it made her think seriously, for the first time, about what she was actually building and what she wanted it to be. She thought about this a lot that summer, usually in the early mornings before the work began, sitting on the porch with coffee and watching the light come over the ridge. She had always thought of Keller land as survival, as the thing she needed to keep. She had not let herself think too far beyond survival because survival was enough to occupy all her attention. But the reservoir was there now, and the herd was growing, and the east barn was solid, and the fence lines were in good shape. And for the first time since her father's funeral, she could see not just the immediate crisis but the horizon beyond it. One morning in late July, Isaac came to sit on the porch steps while she was there with her coffee. He had the same habit she did of being up early, and she had stopped being surprised by it. He settled on the top step with his own cup, looking out at the land, and the morning was so quiet they could hear the creek running. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, not looking at her. "What this ranch could be," she said. "In 5 years, 10. He was quiet for a moment. "Tell me." She had not expected that response. She had expected a comment about the immediate work, or silence, or a shift in topic. She looked at him. He was looking out at the land, but his attention was on her. She could feel it. So she told him. She told him about the breeding program she had been thinking about, specifically developing the winter hardy line that her 2 best breeders represented, because Wyoming winters were not going to get any kinder, and a herd that was truly adapted to survive them was worth more than a larger herd that wasn't. She told him about the idea she had for the North Pasture, which had the best soil of any section of the land if it were properly managed, possibly diversifying into hay production for sale to other ranchers who struggled to grow their own. She talked for longer than she intended, and at some point she stopped and felt the exposure of having said so much, of having let someone see the inside of her thinking. "The breeding program is exactly right," he said quietly. "I've been watching those 2 breeders all spring. The quality is there." He paused. "The hay idea is good. Market for it is consistent, but you'd need to bring in equipment. I know it's a longer-term thing. Worth planning for, though." He looked at her then, and the morning light was doing something to his face, making it open in a way she did not usually see. "You see this place clearly, Opal. You always have." It was the first time he had used her first name. He had called her Miss Keller, or just avoided the address entirely until that moment, and she noticed it the way you notice when a door opens in a house you thought you knew all the rooms of. She did not remark on it. She just said, "Thank you," and looked back at the land, and the morning stretched around them warm and still. Caldwell Creek had a social calendar that operated according to its own logic. There was a summer fair in August, a fixture of the community that gathered every rancher and farmer and shopkeeper and their families for 2 days of livestock competitions, food, and dancing. Opal had not attended in 2 years because the first year she had been nursing her father and the second year she had been in the raw months of grief, and had not wanted to stand in a crowd of people and answer questions about what she intended to do with the ranch. This year, Gus told her firmly that she was going, and when Gus said things firmly, it generally happened. "People need to see you're still standing," he said, which she recognized as wisdom even if she didn't relish it. She went, and she brought Eli, and she almost invited Isaac before reminding herself that she did not bring men places, and that Isaac Walker was her ranch hand, and that was the sum of it. Except that Isaac arrived at the fair anyway, because he had gone into town for supplies and the fair was in town, and she saw him across the fairground in the early afternoon, and she was aware that she noticed him before she noticed anyone else, and that this was information she was not sure what to do with. He saw her too and made his way over, moving through the crowd with the easy, unhurried way he moved through everything, and he touched the brim of his hat to her and she said, "I didn't know you were coming," and he said, "I didn't know I was going to." And they stood together looking at the livestock competition ring as though this were perfectly natural. Several of the men from neighboring ranches made their way over, which was its own education. She could see the moment each of them registered Isaac standing beside her, the quick reassessment, the shift in how they addressed her, and she felt something complex about it: gratitude for Isaac's presence and irritation at what it said about the men doing the reassessing. One of them, a rancher named Carl Bennett, who had known her father and had attended the funeral and had not spoken to her since, said to her, "Heard you're doing all right out there, Opal. Got yourself some help?" She looked at him steadily. "I have a good crew, yes. Keller Land made both its bank payments on time this year." "That's so?" He looked at Isaac. Isaac said quite pleasantly, "She runs a tight operation. Reservoir she put in this spring is going to be worth more than anything else on that land by August." Carl Bennett nodded slowly and said something appropriate and moved on, and Opal did not say anything to Isaac about it until they were standing at the far end of the fairground with cups of lemonade, and she said, "You didn't have to do that." "Do what?" "Tell him about the reservoir. Tell him I run a tight operation." "I know I didn't have to," he said. "It's true, though." He looked at her. "Does it bother you that I said it?" She thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "It bothers me that it mattered that you said it when I was right there to say it myself." "That's a fair thing to be bothered by," he said, and he was not dismissive about it, not the way men usually were when women expressed frustration at the particular kind of invisibility that happened in public. They walked the fair together for the rest of the afternoon, looking at the livestock competition, listening to the speeches, eating pie from the church women's table, and it was comfortable in a way that Opal had not expected to find anything comfortable in a long time. He was easy to be with in crowds, present but not demanding, and he made her laugh twice with observations about the livestock judging that were quiet and precise and very funny. When the dancing started in the evening, she was going to go home. She had said what she needed to say to the people she needed to say it to. She had been seen standing on her own 2 feet. The purpose of the day was accomplished. She was tying her horse to leave when Isaac appeared at her elbow and said, "One dance." "The fiddle player is actually good." She looked at him. The lanterns were lit around the dancing area, and the fiddle was, in fact, good. And the evening was that particular soft quality that August evenings had in Wyoming when the summer was at its best and most generous. "One," she said. It was a waltz, which she had not danced since her father was well enough to dance at the last fair before everything went wrong, and Isaac Walker danced it properly, which meant he had been taught at some point and had paid attention. And they turned in the firefly and lantern light of the Caldwell Creek Fairground while the fiddle played, and she found herself thinking absolutely nothing. Not the bank, not the herd, not the East Barn or the breeding program or any of it. Just the music and the movement and his hand at her waist and the warmth of the summer night. The dance ended and she stepped back and said, "Thank you," in a voice that was steadier than she felt. "Thank you," he said, and something in the way he said it made her understand that he meant more than the dance. She drove home under the Wyoming stars and thought about him, and she let herself do it fully and without the sharp internal correction she usually applied to such thoughts, and she decided that whatever she was feeling was not a crisis and did not need to be managed immediately. She decided to let it be what it was and see what happened. What happened was the late summer, which had its own rhythms and demands, and the work of the ranch continued, and she and Isaac continued to work beside each other every day, and the ease between them deepened into something that had weight and warmth to it. He started to do small things, not dramatic things, not grand gestures, because that was not who he was. He brought her coffee without being asked in the mornings when she was deep in the books. He noticed when the porch step had worked itself loose and repaired it without mentioning it. He remembered that she liked the south-facing section of the yard in the evenings and did not sit there when she clearly needed to be alone with her thinking. She started to do small things too. She made sure there was extra at supper when he had been working particularly hard. She went over the grazing rotation calendar with him at the kitchen table in the evenings in a way that was nominally practical, but that she knew had started to be something she looked forward to. One evening in early September, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and the ranch books open, he said something that was not about the ranch books. "I wrote to my sister in Colorado last week," he said. "Told her where I was." She looked up from the ledger. He was looking at it rather than her, which meant this was something he was navigating carefully. "That's good," she said. "You hadn't written to her, not in a while. I've been moving around enough that there hasn't been a fixed address to write from." A pause. It felt different to have one. She understood exactly what he was saying and chose to engage with it directly because she was Opal Keller and she had never done well with the alternative. "Isaac." He looked up. "Are you telling me you intend to stay?" He held her gaze, and she saw something in him that was both certain and careful, the way a man looks when he knows what he wants and is not sure of its welcome. "I'm telling you I want to. If there's something here worth staying for." The lamp between them flickered slightly, and the ranch was quiet around them, and she thought about every person who had stood at her father's grave and told her it was over. She thought about the $61 in the tin and the 49 head, and the 2 months of winter still ahead of her on that November night, when she had first opened the ledger and understood how bad it really was. She thought about a reservoir full of clear water and a herd that was growing and an east barn with a roof that did not leak. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, just briefly, and she said, "I believe there is." The color that came into his face was something she filed away in the part of her mind that kept the things she wanted to remember. What followed was not a sudden or dramatic change, but a gradual, honest one. The kind of unfolding that happens between two practical people who have decided that the feelings between them are worth the risk of acknowledging. They were both careful in their way, not cold but deliberate, testing the ground before trusting it, which was probably a characteristic shared by people who had both spent years managing precarious situations. He kissed her for the first time on a Saturday morning in late September in the south pasture, where they had ridden out to check on the herd. And it happened because she turned to say something about the condition of the grass and found him already looking at her with that focused attention he usually reserved for things that required solving. And she realized she was the thing he was trying to figure out, and she saved him the trouble of figuring by meeting him halfway. It was a simple, unhurried kiss, the kind that comes from two people who have already decided and are just now confirming it, and when they separated he said, "I've been wanting to do that since February." "Since February," she said, "the month you arrived. You walked out of that barn into the snow with your hands full of grain and you looked at me like you were deciding something," he said. "I thought, that is someone who has already made up her mind about this world and is just waiting for it to catch up." She laughed, surprised and pleased, and in the south pasture with the cattle moving slowly through the September grass and the ridge lying dark against the pale blue sky, Isaac Walker took her hand and she let him hold it, and that was how that chapter of her life began. October brought the second fall with its cascade of tasks, the winterizing that everything depended on, the herd count, the feed inventory, the preparations that she had done alone last year in a fog of grief and financial terror, and that she did now with a crew of 3 and a partner beside her who knew the work and loved the land with a feeling she recognized, because it was the same feeling she had for it. They talked seriously about the future for the first time in late October, sitting on the porch after supper when the evenings were cold enough for coats, and the sky was that deep autumn black scattered with more stars than the eye could properly account for. "I want to make this mine officially," he said, "if you'd want that." She had been thinking about this for weeks without letting herself think about it directly. "What does officially look like to you?" "Whatever it looks like to you," he said simply. "It's your land, Opal. It always will be. I want to be here. I want to build this with you, however that works for you." She looked at the stars. She thought about her grandfather and her father in Keller land with its burned-in crossbeam name. She thought about what it had meant to her to keep that name, the effort of it, the cost, the love underneath it. "My name stays on the land," she said. "It should. And yours on the gate beside it," she said. "If you're here, if we're doing this together." He turned to look at her in the dark, and she could feel the quality of his attention even without seeing his face clearly. "Are you asking me something?" "I believe I am," she said, which was about as close to asking as she intended to get, because she was Opal Keller and she had always done things in her own way. He laughed quietly, the real laugh that she did not hear from him often enough, the one that came from somewhere genuine. And he said, "Yes." Whatever version of that question was, yes. They were married in Caldwell Creek in November, in the church where Reverend Sykes had told Opal at her father's grave that a woman alone on 30 acres of struggling cattle land was not a wise decision. She noticed, with some satisfaction, that he performed the ceremony with appropriate grace, and did not appear to connect the woman he was marrying to the grieving young widow he had advised so freely a year earlier. Gus Perkins stood up for them, which made him straighten his shoulders and look 20 years younger. Eli Barrow had brought his mother from Laramie to watch, which was unexpected and touching. Several of the neighboring ranchers attended, including Carl Bennett, who shook Isaac's hand and told Opal he had heard good things about the operation she was running, and she thanked him politely and meant it approximately 40%. The ring Isaac gave her was simple, a thin gold band, and he had had it engraved on the inside with a date, which turned out to be the date she had sent him the letter, not the date they had met or any other date. The date the letter was sent. When she realized what it was, she looked up at him and he said quietly, "That's the day that started this." And she pressed her lips together and put the ring on her finger and wore it for the rest of her life. The winter of 1882 was nothing like the winter of 1881. It was still hard in the way Wyoming winters were always hard, cold and demanding and merciless in its storms. But Opal went into it with a full herd count of 67 head, a sound barn on both sides, a reservoir that had proven itself in September's dry stretch, and Isaac Walker sleeping beside her in the house her grandfather had built. She also went into it with the knowledge that the bank debt had been reduced by a third. The cattle sale in the fall had been the best she had managed, helped by the quality of the animals and by Isaac's existing connections with buyers in Laramie and Cheyenne. And the extra $40 from the spring sale had gone into a savings account she had opened at a different bank in Laramie, not Pruitt's Bank. They lost 2 head that winter, not to exposure or accident, but to an older steer that had been ailing since October and 2 others he infected with a lung complaint, and they caught it early enough that the loss stopped there. 2 head against 67 was a different mathematics entirely from 11 against 49, and she allowed herself to understand that things were genuinely changing. In the long evenings of that second winter, she and Isaac talked in the way that 2 people who are genuinely interested in each other, and also genuinely interested in the same project talk, which is to say constantly and productively, and occasionally in circles that resolve themselves suddenly at unexpected moments. They planned the breeding program formally, selecting the animals, documenting the lineage, developing the criteria. They planned the North Pasture Hay project as a 3-year initiative, acknowledging they could not afford the equipment yet, but beginning to work out what would be needed and when. He told her more about himself in those evenings, about growing up in Missouri with his parents and his sister Clara, about the years on cattle drives where he had learned the trade in the hard-knocks way that was the only way it was actually learned, about the Hendricks operation and what had gone right there, and what he had carried from it. She told him about her grandfather, who had built the house and named the land, and had a quality of absolute certainty about his place in the world that she had always admired, even though she knew his certainty had sometimes made him inflexible. She told him about her father, who had been gentler and more imaginative, but who had been broken open by the series of hard years in a way she still mourned. She told him about the 2 years she had nursed her father, what it had taken and what it had taught her, the patience and the grief and the strange intimacy of caring for someone you love through their dying. He listened to all of it with the same quality of attention he gave everything, and she found that the act of being fully heard was something she had been hungry for without knowing it. Spring came to Wyoming again in 1883 with its usual reluctance, and then sudden rush, and Opal Keller Walker was 3 months along when the mud season began. She told Isaac on a March morning while they were doing the feed calculations, setting down her pencil and saying it the same way she said most important things, which was directly and without preamble. He sat very still for a moment, and then he looked up from the ledger and his face did something she had never quite seen it do before, an opening that was different from any other kind of opening, and he said her name and then said nothing else for a moment. "Good," she said, because she was practical first and sentimental second, and she needed to know. "Better than anything," he said, and his voice had something rough at the edge of it that was not distress. She reached across the table and touched his hand, the same gesture she had made months ago when everything was still uncertain, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat at the kitchen table in March with the spring sounds coming through the walls of the house and the ledger forgotten between them. She managed the ranch all through the pregnancy, which surprised no one who knew her. She modified what she did in the second half, not because she was told to, but because she assessed the situation accurately and made reasonable decisions, which included letting Isaac and Eli handle the tasks that required heavy lifting and limiting her horseback time in the last 2 months. She continued the books, the breeding records, the planning, the correspondence with cattle buyers. She was present and active and in charge, because she was always present and active and in charge, and she refused to be treated as an invalid by anyone, including Isaac, who was thoughtful about it in a way that she appreciated precisely because he was thoughtful rather than overbearing. Their son was born in September of 1883, delivered by the doctor who came from Caldwell Creek with his bag and his steadiness, in the same house where Opal had been born. Isaac was outside on the porch for most of it because that was the custom, and also because Opal had told him firmly to go outside, and when the doctor brought him in, she was sitting up in the bed with their son in her arms and looking at the baby with an expression that Isaac would later describe to his sister Clara as the most remarkable thing he had ever seen. "Come here," Opal said to him. He came and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby, this small, red-faced, entirely new person with Opal's coloring, and Isaac thought, the most determined expression he had ever seen on a creature so recently arrived in the world. "What do you want to call him?" Isaac asked. She had thought about this. "Emmett," she said, "for my father, and James for yours, if that's all right." He looked at her. "How do you know my father's name? You told me once in December when you were talking about Missouri. You said James Walker was the most stubborn man you'd ever met outside of cattle." He had said that. He had not remembered that she had filed it away. "Emmett James Walker," he said. "Emmett James Walker," she confirmed. The baby opened his eyes at the sound of voices above him, and looked at them with the considering look of someone who was taking the measure of the world, and had not yet decided what to make of it. "He looks like he's already planning something," Isaac said. "Good," Opal said. "He's going to need to." Emmett James Walker grew up on Keller land in the way children grow up on working ranches, which is to say embedded in the life of the place from infancy, carried in the early months in a sling across his mother's chest while she went about her work, then toddling behind his father in the yard, then running ahead of both of them with the specific reckless confidence of a child who has been loved into certainty. He had his mother's amber hair and his father's dark eyes, and a laugh that Gus Perkins claimed he could hear from across the south pasture, which Gus said as a compliment of the highest order. Gus Perkins. He had not left the ranch. He had threatened to retire every winter and then found something essential to do every spring. And by the time Emmett was walking, Gus had transitioned into a role that was less ranch hand and more beloved fixture. The person who told Emmett stories in the evenings, and who kept the chicken coop in a state of fortress-like security against foxes, and who could be consulted on any question involving cattle, and would give you an answer even if he had to make it up. Eli Barrow had left in the spring of 1883, gone north to try his luck in Montana, but he wrote letters to Opal and Isaac from time to time, and they wrote back. And in 1885, he wrote to say he had found work on a cattle operation in the Bitterroot Valley, and he was doing well and he was grateful for the years at Keller Land. And Opal wrote back that the gratitude went both ways. They hired 2 new hands in the spring of 1884, brothers named Dell and Samuel Cook from a family that had lost their own homestead in a land dispute. And they were good workers and became part of the fabric of the place in their own way. The breeding program produced its first significant results in 1884, when the winter hardy line they had been developing proved itself through one of the hardest winters the territory had seen since the early 1870s. Their neighbors lost significant portions of their herds, but Keller Land lost 6 out of 91, and the 6 were older animals whose time was probably near regardless. The ranchers who survived that winter with functioning operations were the ones who had adapted, and Opal had adapted, and the quiet satisfaction of that was one of the most complete feelings she had ever experienced. Word got around, as it does in small territorial communities where survival is the baseline currency. People came to ask about the breeding program, how she had selected for the winter hardy traits, what the management differences were. She talked to them all, because she had not survived by keeping knowledge to herself, and she did not intend to start now. Isaac stood beside her at these conversations, not in front of her, and let her speak for what she had built, which was right, because it was what she had built. Harlan Prout retired from the bank in 1885 and moved to Denver. She did not throw a party for this, but she was not unhappy about it. The Hay Project, their 3-year plan, launched in earnest in 1885 when they had saved enough from the cattle operation to invest in a mowing machine and a horse-drawn rake. The North Pasture, which Isaac had identified as having the best soil on the property, proved to be everything they had hoped. The first hay harvest was modest, but the quality was high, and 2 neighboring ranches who had struggled to grow sufficient feed through the dry years paid fair prices for it. Opal sat down with the ledger after the first hay harvest and the fall cattle sale, and looked at the numbers for a long time. Then she called Isaac in from the yard and she pointed at the final line and she said, "Look at that." He looked at it. The balance. After all operating costs, after the bank payment, which was in its final year and would be paid off in full by the following spring, there was a profit. A real profit, not a survival margin, not a break-even, but actual profit that represented what this land could produce when it was properly managed and honestly committed to. He looked at the number and then he looked at her, and she was looking at him, and the expression on her face was the kind of thing that comes from somewhere so deep and real that it bypasses the face's usual management systems and just arrives there, undone and luminous and honest. "Your grandfather's land," he said softly. "Our land," she said. He pulled her into him, there at the kitchen table with the ledger open between them, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and let herself feel all of it, the years of it, the weight and the work and the grief and the joy of it, the full impossible measure of what had been built from those $61.49 head and a winter that should have ended her. In 1886, on a morning in early May when the land was at its absolute best, green and new, and smelling of rain and good soil, Opal Walker stood at the gate of Keller Land and looked up at the crossbeam. Her grandfather's burned lettering was there, Keller land, solid and permanent, and beside it, added 2 years after the wedding by Isaac's own hand, smaller but clear, Walker. She had told him she wanted to keep her name on the land, and he had said it should stay. She had told him she wanted his name there too, and he had carved it himself on a winter evening while Emmett, a toddler then, banged a wooden spoon on the kitchen floor in what he apparently considered music. Emmett was 3 years old now and already opinionated about cattle, which was either promising or alarming depending on the day. He had Opal's habit of watching everything carefully before deciding what he thought, and Isaac's instinct for going straight to the heart of a practical problem, and Gus Perkins' habit of saying whatever he was thinking without particular filter, which last trait had produced several memorable moments and would doubtless produce more. Opal was also expecting again. 4 months along, easier this time in the physical sense, different in the emotional sense because she knew now what it meant, what came after. She had told Isaac in the same direct way she told him everything, and he had held her for a long time afterward, his face against her hair, saying nothing, which was the right thing. Standing at the gate on that May morning, she heard him come up behind her. He came to stand beside her and looked up at the crossbeam the same way she was looking at it, and for a moment they were both just looking at the name of the thing they had built. Gus told Emmett this morning that if he keeps sneaking into the chicken coop, the chickens are going to start sneaking back, Isaac said. She laughed. What did Emmett say? He said the chickens were welcome to try. She shook her head, smiling, and took his hand where it hung at his side, and he wrapped his fingers around hers without looking down. I was thinking, she said. What were you thinking? That we should expand the breeding program documentation, write it up properly, what we've learned about selecting for winter hardiness, the mortality rates, the characteristics we've tracked. It could be useful to other ranchers who want to try the same approach. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the Territorial Agricultural Office in Cheyenne has been putting out notices about that kind of information sharing. I know, I was thinking I might write to them. I think you should, he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the land, that long, assessing sweep of his eyes that she had seen on the first day he rode through the gate, and that still made her feel, 3 years later, like she was seeing something true about the world. You have been good for this ranch, she said. He looked at her then. You built this ranch, he said. I helped. We helped each other, she said. He smiled at her, the full smile that she had earned in increments over the years, and that still did something significant to her chest when it appeared. Yes, he said, we did. The second child was born in November of 1886, a daughter they named Clara after Isaac's sister, with a middle name of Me for Opal's grandmother, who had come west from Ohio with nothing but a sewing kit and a constitution of absolute iron. Clara Me Walker came into the world with a voice that could be heard in the yard and dark hair like her father and gray-green eyes like nobody in either family, which she seemed to regard as her particular distinction from her earliest conscious moments. Clara Me Walker was the kind of child who was in charge of any situation she entered, which Opal recognized as a character trait from the inside. Emmett, who had been king of the household by default for 3 years, adjusted to the new arrangement with better grace than might have been expected, largely because Clara fixed him with those gray-green eyes in her first weeks, and he appeared to decide she was worthy of his respect, which was a social dynamic that persisted between them for the rest of their lives. The bank debt on Keller land was paid in full in the spring of 1887. Opal made the last payment herself in person at the First Territorial Bank in Cheyenne, because she had decided that was how it should be done. Isaac offered to come with her, and she told him she wanted him to, because this was their thing to do together, and they left the children with Gus and the Cook brothers and drove to Cheyenne on a clear March morning. The bank officer who accepted the final payment was not Harlan Pruitt, who was in Denver, but a younger man named Thomas Calloway who was professional and kind, and who had not been there for any of the history, which made the whole thing cleaner somehow. He provided the receipt and the release of the lien, and he shook both their hands, and Opal folded the papers into her bag and they walked out of the First Territorial Bank into the Cheyenne March sunshine. On the street outside the bank, Isaac stopped walking and she stopped too. They stood on the board sidewalk in the sun, and he took the document bag from her hand and put it under his arm, and then he took her face in both his hands, right there on the public street, and he kissed her with a thoroughness that made two passing cowboys and a woman with a market basket all find something else to look at. When he let her go, she said, "That was very public." "I know," he said, completely unrepentant. She straightened her hat and looked at him, at this man who had ridden through her gate on a February day with snow on the ground and dark eyes and a bedroll, who had looked at her struggling ranch and seen what it could be, who had sat at her father's kitchen table and drunk her coffee and told her the truth about what the work would take and then done every bit of it, who had learned to love the land the way she loved it, not as conquest or extraction but as relationship, patient and reciprocal and demanding. "I want to go home," she said. "Then let's go home," he said, and they got back in the wagon and turned north toward Wyoming. Keller Land in the years that followed became, quietly and through consistent work and good judgment, one of the more respected operations in the region. Not the largest, not the flashiest, not the one with the most dramatic history, though the history was there for anyone who asked. Just a well-run ranch that produced quality cattle and high-quality hay, and was known among its neighbors for something that was harder to quantify than yield or profit, which was the sense that it was managed by people who understood what land actually was and what it asked of the people who worked it. The breeding program documentation that Opal wrote up and sent to the Territorial Agricultural Office in Cheyenne was published in their 1887 report, attributed to O. Keller Walker of Caldwell Creek, Wyoming Territory. She received 3 letters in response from other ranchers in the territory who had questions about the program, and she answered all 3 in full. Isaac received a letter from the Hendricks family in Carbon County that year, asking if he knew of anyone who might be interested in helping them with a new expansion project. He wrote back and said he was settled where he was, but he could make some recommendations, which he did, and one of the men he recommended was the young ranch manager who ended up making the Hendricks operation into something genuinely impressive in the 1890s. Gus Perkins did finally retire in the autumn of 1888, when his shoulder became too painful to be managed with the usual stoicism, and the doctor told him that the shoulder had done about what it was going to do. He retired to a room in the boarding house in Caldwell Creek, where he ate supper with the Walkers on Sunday evenings and could be found at the ranch at least 3 days a week, ostensibly to visit, but actually because he could not stay away from the chickens, who had come to accept his presence as a fixed feature of their world. The Cook brothers, Dell and Samuel, stayed on at Keller Land. They were good men and genuine ranchers, and they became so much a part of the place that when Dell married a young woman named Rosa Fuentes from a family in the territory, they had the wedding supper at the Keller Land main house because it was the largest table anyone in their immediate circle possessed, and it was the right place for it. Emmett Walker was 7 years old when the bank debt was paid off and 9 when Clara could walk faster than any other child in Caldwell Creek, and 11 when he announced that he was going to be a rancher like his parents, and 12 when he amended this to say he was going to be a rancher and a writer, which Opal received with complete equanimity because she was not in the business of telling people what they could be. Isaac took Emmett out on the full ranch work for the first time at 11, not the easy parts but the real parts, the cold morning feed checks and the fence line mending, and the cattle health assessment that required knowing what you were looking at. Emmett had the instinct for it, the particular kind of intelligence that expressed itself in the physical world rather than through words, and Isaac watched his son move through the ranch the way he had watched Opal move through it, with the ease of someone for whom this land was simply home, and something in him settled that he hadn't known was still seeking. Clara Walker was not interested in cattle ranching in the least, which she made clear at an early age with the directness she shared with her mother. She was interested in everything else, in the books that came through the lending library in Caldwell Creek, in mathematics, in the ways that things worked. She was going to be something that did not exist yet in Wyoming, or at least did not yet have a name, and Opal recognized this in her, and was proud of it in a way that was specific and quiet and entirely real. In the evenings of those years, when the work was done and supper was finished and Emmett was reading something and Clara was doing something mathematical at the corner of the kitchen table, Isaac and Opal sat on the porch in the particular quality of Wyoming evening light and talked, or were quiet together with equal comfort. The stars came out over the ridge and the creek ran its sound through the dark, and the cattle were settled in the pastures, and the land breathed around them. This land that had nearly been lost and had been reclaimed through work and stubbornness and honesty, and ultimately love, which had been the unexpected thing, the thing that had come into the repair work and changed what was being built. She reached for his hand one such evening in the summer of 1889, when Wyoming became a state and everyone in Caldwell Creek had something to say about it, and the evening had a kind of celebratory electricity in the air. "What are you thinking about?" she said, which was what he had asked her on that July morning 3 years before with the warm light coming over the ridge. "Same thing I think about most evenings," he said. "What's that?" He looked at her, with the evening light doing something to his face and the particular directness in his eyes that had been one of the first things she had noticed, and was still one of the things she loved best about him. "How glad I am that you wrote that letter." She felt the words land in her chest, warm and complete and real. "I was desperate," she said honestly. "I know that's not the point." "What's the point?" He lifted their joined hands slightly, a gesture that encompassed the porch and the house and the land in the evening dark. "The point is you didn't give up. You wrote the letter instead of giving up." She thought about that February, the $61 and the 49 head and the men at her father's grave. She thought about Harlan Pruitt's claws and the reservoir and the east barn and the herd building back and the breeding program and Clara Mee's gray-green eyes and Emmett's laugh that Gus could hear across the south pasture. "I was told it wouldn't survive," she said. "I know, they were wrong. We were going to run it into the ground. And instead," he said. She looked at the land in the dark, her grandfather's land, her father's land, her land, their land. The burned-in crossbeam name at the gate with Walker beside it. The reservoir full of clear water. The north pasture waiting for tomorrow's work. The house with the lamp in the window and the children inside. "And instead we built something better on top," she said. He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles, a quiet gesture, the kind that meant more for being ordinary, and she leaned her head against his shoulder and listened to Wyoming in the evening, the creek and the cattle and the wind that always came eventually, and she was, in the most complete and unqualified sense of the word, home. The years continued, as years do, each with their particular texture and challenge and grace. Wyoming statehood in 1890 brought new legal frameworks for land rights that Opal followed closely and understood thoroughly. Because the land was the thing, and understanding its legal status was part of managing it. She went twice to Cheyenne for meetings of the Territorial, now State, Agricultural Board, the only woman in the room both times, and she said what she had to say in both rooms with the clarity and substance that made it impossible to be dismissed entirely, though some tried. Isaac went with her on the second trip, not to speak for her but because he had business with a cattle buyer in Cheyenne, and because he liked Cheyenne and because she had asked him to come, which she had done with the same directness she brought to everything, saying simply, "Come to Cheyenne with me," and he had said, "When do we leave?" Emmett grew into a young man who was, as predicted, both a genuine rancher and a genuine writer, keeping detailed journals of the ranch's operations and the land's seasonal changes that Opal suspected would be valuable someday in ways she could not entirely predict. He took on the North Pasture hay operation as his particular domain at 15, and ran it with his mother's systematic precision and his father's instinctive adjustments. And it had become, by the early 1890s, a significant portion of the ranch's income. Clara went east to school, to a women's college in Ohio, which was a thing that required considerable saving and considerable argument with the narrower-minded portion of Caldwell Creek society, and no argument at all within the Walker household, because Opal and Isaac had always agreed completely on the question of what their children should be allowed to become. She wrote letters home every week, long letters full of mathematics and observations and the particular humor she had always had, and they wrote back, Isaac with news of the ranch and Opal with news of everything else and her honest responses to Clara's ideas, which were always engaged and sometimes challenging and never condescending. Del Cook and his wife Rosa had 3 children of their own by the mid-1890s, and the children of the ranch, Emmett Walker and the Cook children, grew up together in the way that ranch children do, knowing each other's families as an extension of their own, the land as shared context, the work as shared inheritance. Gus Perkins died in the winter of 1893, peacefully and in his bed in the Caldwell Creek boarding house, at the age of 74. He had lived long enough to see the ranch become everything it had been in its best years and more, long enough to hold both Walker children on his knee and tell them about their grandfather Emmett and his grandfather before him, and the long chain of people and work that had made the land what it was. His funeral was held in Caldwell Creek and attended by more people than anyone expected, because Gus had been the kind of man whose presence was larger than his circumstances, and his absence made itself felt clearly. Opal sat with Isaac in the church pew and held his hand through the service and thought about continuity, about the way things passed forward, about Gus's hands on the bridle that first February and the coffee he had made, while she showed Isaac the ledger and all the quiet, essential things he had done in the years between. She did not cry in the church. She cried later at home with Isaac's arms around her and let herself feel the full weight of the loss, and then got up the next morning and went to work, which was what Gus would have recognized as the appropriate response. Keller land went into the 20th century strong. The herd was above 120 for the first time since Opal's grandfather's best years. The breeding program was established and documented, and had influenced practice on several other operations in the region. The hay production was steady and profitable, and the North Creek Reservoir had been expanded twice, once by Isaac and Emmett working together over a summer, and was now large enough to serve the full operation through any reasonable drought. The crossbeam over the gate, Keller Land, Walker, had weathered to a silver gray that made the burned lettering stand out even more sharply, and Opal made sure it was maintained, the wood treated against the weather, the letters clear. She was 43 years old when the century turned, and she stood at the gate on the first morning of 1900 with a cup of coffee, and looked at the name of the place and felt the long, unbroken line of it, from her grandfather's hand to this morning. Isaac came up behind her and put his arm around her shoulders. He was 46, with gray at his temples and the deep weathering of a face that had spent its adult life outdoors, and he was still the most solid presence she had ever known, the most constant and trustworthy and true. "Happy New Century," he said. She leaned into him. "Happy New Century. Emmett's already in the south pasture," he said. "Been there since before light." "He gets that from you," she said. "He gets it from you," he said. "I learned it from you," she smiled. The Wyoming morning was cold and clear, the sky the pale, particular blue of a winter day before the color fully developed, and the land was white with frost, and the creek was running somewhere in the quiet, and the cattle were settled in the pasture, and Emmett was already at work, and Clara was in Ohio sending letters home that made her parents think and laugh and argue in the good way, and the crossbeam said Keller Land, Walker over the gate. She had been told it would not survive. She had come close to proving those people right, close enough that she could still remember the exact number, $61 and change, 49 head, 4 months to an impossible payment. She had driven it as hard as she could, and the winter had driven back, and she had lost ground before she found the path. And then a man had ridden through the gate on a dark bay horse in the snow, and she had walked out to meet him with her hands full of grain, and they had built something from the wreckage that was better than what had been there before. Not because the failure had been necessary, but because the people who had come through it together were necessary to each other, and from that necessity had grown something that looked, from the inside, exactly like love, which was probably what it had always been heading toward from the moment she put pen to paper and wrote the letter that was honest about everything. She finished her coffee. The morning was waiting, and there was work to do, and the land was theirs, and that was enough. That was more than enough. That was, in every way that mattered, everything.